Hello and welcome back. This week we're making Hokkaido milk bread. Now if you've never had it before, it's very similar to brioche. It's a butter and egg enriched sandwich bread essentially. Now this is the first time I've ever made this, and over the course of this video I do make a few mistakes here and there, and I thought it would be useful for me to talk through those when I make them and explain perhaps how you can avoid doing them yourself. So the first thing we need to do is make Tangzhong, and this is a big part of how this bread differs to a brioche. Now a Tangzhong is essentially a pre-gelatinized, pre-cooked portion of the flour. To make this you add a certain amount of the flour from your recipe, mix it with some of the water and some of the milk, and cook it like you'd cook a roux until it's a thick paste. After that's cooled, it's incorporated into the bread dough with the other ingredients, and what this does is it helps the bread stay soft and stay moist and chewy, and it lasts much longer that way. I first weighed out the water and then added the flour to that, whisking that together before adding the milk. I did this so there wasn't too much liquid when I whisked in the flour, because otherwise you can find it gets lumpy and it doesn't incorporate properly, so it's easier to make that sort of thin paste before adding the milk. I cooked it over a low to medium heat for about 3 to 4 minutes until it started to thicken, and then I kept cooking it, making sure it didn't start to burn on the bottom until it was a nice thick paste. Once it's cooked, you need to let it cool to room temperature, so I scraped it into a little bowl and then covered it with cling film, making sure the cling film touches the surface of the Tangzhong to stop a skin forming. With the Tangzhong made and cooling down, it's time to move on to making the dough itself. The first step for me is to mix the yeast with a teaspoon of the sugar and the milk. The reason I do this is just to check that the yeast is active before adding it to the bread. If it's dead, then you'll have wasted all that dough and all that time, and your bread won't rise. Set that aside for about 10 minutes, and if it gets nice and bubbly, that means your yeast is active and ready to use. In the meantime, you can mix together the remaining sugar, the salt and the flour in your mixer bowl, and just stir that together ready for the other ingredients. You'll also need to add 1 egg, which I added to the yeast and milk mixture before adding all of that to the flour and loosely mixing it together with a chopstick. Finally, once you've incorporated all that liquid into the flour, just add in the Tangzhong and it's ready to go to your mixer. Now at a push you could do this by hand, but because there's quite a lot of sugar, butter, eggs in this dough, it's really quite sticky, so it requires a lot of work. If you're doing it by hand, just be prepared that your hands are going to get really sticky. You want to probably have some experience making easier breads first before moving on to this. With all that said, if you've got a mixer, it's a very simple process. Using the dough hook attachment, start it on slow just to make sure all those ingredients are mixed together and the Tangzhong is fully incorporated. Once you've got a rough dough formed, then you can start adding the butter bit by bit. I did it in about 3 inclusions, each time scraping down the sides of the bowl with a spatula to make sure that nothing was getting stuck to the edges and not being incorporated into the dough. After about 5 to 6 minutes with all the butter incorporated, I turned up the speed to about medium-high and let it mix for a further 2 to 3 minutes until it was releasing itself completely from the bowl and beginning to slap against the edges. That's a good sign that the gluten network is strong enough to pull the dough away from the sticky sides of the bowl. With the dough mixed, shape it into a ball, place it into a clean bowl and let it prove for a couple of hours or until it's doubled in size. With the dough risen, it's time to shape the loaf. Now there are many different methods to do this. The one I chose involves dividing the dough into 4 separate pieces. I degassed the dough by pushing it with my hands until I'd knocked out most of the air. I then weighed the dough as a whole and then divided it into 4 equal portions. It was in the shaping that I made a few mistakes which I'd like to highlight. For the first portion I rolled it out using a rolling pin, dusting it with a little extra flour to make sure it didn't stick. And this one turned out quite smooth but didn't rise quite as much as the other 3 parts. For the other 3, I just used my fingers and pushed it out into a rough rectangle before shaping it and rolling it and adding it to the tin. What happened with the final bake, as you'll see later, is that the 3 that I didn't use the pin for tended to rise a bit more, and I think that was because I hadn't degassed it quite as much as I had with the rolling pin. The other issue I found with these 3 was that the top wasn't quite as smooth because it didn't roll out evenly. So I'd recommend going with the rolling pin option if you want that really smooth, professional looking loaf at the end. So as you can see here, the method I used to shape the dough is first to push it into the rectangle, then fold in the corners into the middle to form a rough square, before rolling the dough into a rectangle and then rolling that up on itself. Try to make sure that your rectangle is roughly the width of your loaf tin so it fits in quite snugly, and make sure to grease your loaf tin before adding the bread, as this will help give colour to the edges of your loaf and also make sure it releases a little easier from the tin once it's baked. Now as you can see, from this point onwards, instead of using the rolling pin, I just use my fingers to push each portion into the rough shape of a rectangle. I did this because I didn't want to incorporate any more flour into the dough, but also I found that it was a bit easier to get that original rectangular shape than with the rolling pin. However, you can see that the dough is a lot puffier and the air is not knocked out of it as evenly, and that meant that they rose less evenly in the bake, and that formed an uneven final shape to the loaf. You can see here the portion on the right is the one that I used the rolling pin for, and that's much smoother and more evenly shaped than the other three. The final step before baking is to allow the bread to prove covered once again until the dough has risen to roughly in line with the top of the loaf tin. As the bread proves, you can preheat your oven to 180 degrees Celsius or 350 degrees Fahrenheit. The final step is to egg wash the loaf with a little egg mixed with some water, and that will give it that nice golden brown shine after it finishes baking. Now during the bake I did make one other mistake, and that was to place the bread too high in my oven. It surprised me how much it rose, and the bread actually hit the top of my oven, which explains why the surface of the bread is slightly damaged in the final product. After 25 to 30 minutes in the oven, your bread should be fully baked. If you're unsure, add an instant read thermometer to the centre of the loaf and it should read above 94 degrees Celsius, which is about 200-201 degrees Fahrenheit. Give the bread 3 to 5 minutes to cool in the tin before tipping it out and letting it cool on a rack fully before cutting it. That's it for this week. Thanks so much for watching. Please do subscribe, hit that like button if you enjoyed this video, and see you next time.